What ifs are so hard. I can't imagine that if I hadn't, what my viewpoint would be if I hadn't had these experiences. But I think I would always wonder if, just because of the way that I was raised, but I do think that I would be more like an atheist without these experiences.
This conversation's format was a little different than what I'm used to. It took place sending voice clips via a messaging app. It definitely had its advantages, like I was able to have more time to think of questions. However, at times there was a day or so between messages, and this made it really difficult to remember what we had talked about. Anyway, here's the conversation.
I guess the first question I can ask is, what do you believe?
That's a really great question, and it's really hard for me in general to explain to people, and so I usually don't. I just tell people that I'm agnostic because I feel that that just is as close as I can get. But I believe that there's a God. I just don't believe that anyone does know or can know anything about that.
I'm just going to repeat back what I think I heard. So it sounds like you believe that a God does exist. However, you believe that nothing about this God can be known.
So, for instance, Muslims, Christians, religions from all over the world will tell you, that they know for a fact that there is a God because of either whatever reason or experience that they have. They know for a fact, and it's not something that they're willing to deny. So, while yes, I do think that there is something out there, there is a God, I don't think that anybody can really know what that is. Lots of people claim to have some knowledge on it, but I don't think that anyone can fully know.
On a scale of 0 to 100, what is your confidence level that a God exists? Where 0 is all you have is questions, you don't really know and you're really unsure. And 100 is you're absolutely 100% certain that a God exists.
I am 100% sure that something exists. The nature of it, its interest, involvement, that's all up for debate.
What makes you get to that 100%?
But then again, my 100% sure, that's because I feel that, I don't know how to phrase this, I feel as though I have sufficient evidence for myself. But I always say that when it comes to anything supernatural, what is sufficient evidence is up for debate. So what might be sufficient for me might not be sufficient for someone else. The 100% mark, I would say, is very interesting, not just for myself, but for other people. I'm curious as to why other people are 100% sure, and not only that, but 100% sure about what God is 100% right, because I'm not sure how they've come to that conclusion. For me personally, it has a lot to do with my experiences, and I don't usually get into that with people for lots of reasons. For instance, Christians, let's say, they hold a lot of value in testimony. Just in my experience, other people's testimonies and experiences, they hold that as valuable and as evidence for other people, but it's not, or at least it shouldn't be. Usually people consider evidence something that can be, measured and repeated and marked, and unless you're doing a scientific experiment, you're not going to get that with supernatural stuff or spiritual stuff. So I don't think that other people's experiences should be held so highly, because people lie and people can't be trusted, or some people are crazy. So there's so much that can go wrong with that. And again, a Christian might say that they speak to God and they know, or that they have a personal relationship with God, and so they know that not only is there a God, but what God there is. But many Muslims will tell you the same thing. People from religions all over the world will swear up and down that they have had these experiences that not only solidify their knowledge in a God, but what God, and they can't all be right. But I do believe that people do have these experiences, and I believe that people have these experiences in all different religions. So, again, I've had experiences that, make me believe that there's something. So, but I don't claim to have knowledge on it. So again, it's just easier for me to say agnostic. And even though I do believe that there's a God or something, it's just easier to say agnostic because I don't claim to have any knowledge on what that is, what its involvement is, what its wants are, if it's even relevant.
You mentioned personal experiences and all these different people having all these different experiences. Can an experience that someone has be sufficient evidence for anything, particularly God?
Absolutely, we all learn through experiences, but people are biased, and that's going to taint their view. So if somebody is a Muslim or a Christian or a pagan or whatever, and they have an experience that helps solidify their belief, it's also going to be tainted by their bias.
I'm going to ask a hypothetical question here. So if someone was to have an experience with God, a personal experience, that possibly could be evidence for God. I don't know what this would look like, but let's say someone has a personal experience, and because of that experience, they conclude that there is no God. Can that be considered evidence then?
Yeah, if a person has an experience that they believe is sufficient evidence, then yeah, that would be sufficient evidence to that person. But it would not be sufficient evidence to somebody else. So it's really, like I'd said, people's personal experiences or testimonies are not evidence to other people. They are only evidence to the person who it happens to. You and I might, let's say, hypothetically, we have the exact same experience and we come to different conclusions based on that. Then that would mean that maybe that experience was not sufficient evidence for one of us, but it was for the other. So it's really debatable. People interpret information differently, and I acknowledge that. There's a possibility that I'm wrong, but that's just not how I interpreted it, and that's just not my viewpoint. I acknowledge that I spent a good portion of my life indoctrined, and I try my hardest not to let that taint my viewpoints and not to be biased, but I am human.
Do you think that someone can have a personal experience and come to a 100% conclusion that something is true based on that experience, but in reality, that thing that they came to 100% true, believing that was 100% true, actually is false?
That is absolutely a possibility.
Based on personal experiences, do you think it's a good idea for someone to be at that 100% mark?
Although I was raised, I'll say a cult, because it was like that. I feel like I've had enough experiences and information now to help me determine that they were wrong and leave that lifestyle. I feel like I've had enough experiences to justify my viewpoint where I'm at currently, but I'm always open to new knowledge and new information. I do think that personal experiences, it's not just enough for some people. I do think that depending on the experience itself, that will play a major factor in, the 100% mark. Do I think it's right for me personally, like where I'm at, to feel 100%? Again, I'm biased. I do. I think that my conclusion based off my experiences is pretty correct.
Are personal experiences a good way to determine truth?
Are personal experiences a good way to determine truth? Sometimes. You can definitely determine truth based off of your own experiences, but that's not always the case. Sometimes, like, let's say you might meet someone and think that's a totally nice person, but you've just been deceived or manipulated, and so therefore your personal experience did not help you determine. But if you have a very, say, grand or repetitive over and over, and each time it leads you to the same conclusion, you would need more evidence or a more grand explanation to change your conclusion.
If only sometimes personal experiences can determine truth, does that mean that personal experiences can sometimes be unreliable?
Absolutely. But again, I can't think of a good example. If you have an experience that leads you to a conclusion, you might be like, let's say 20-30% on that conclusion. But if you have if you witnessed 9/11 happen, you would know for a fact through your own personal experience that it did happen and you were there. And for someone to say it didn't happen, you would need a very good explanation to come to a different conclusion. So I'll go back to the other example that I used. If you meet somebody and think, that's a lovely person, you might be like, yeah, that's a lovely person. And then somebody tells you that they did this terrible thing. You'd be like, wow, I thought they were nice. And then you would change your conclusion. But if you knew them for 30 years and they were nothing but wonderful, and then you hear a accusation that does not match their character, you might dispute that a little bit more. So I would say that personal experience can be enough, but it also can't be. I think it really depends on the amount of experiences that have led you to the conclusion and the experiences themselves, and how monumental they were. Maybe that's not the right word.
I'm going to try to repeat back what I think you said, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. If I say something and it's not what you think, just say, hey, Pierce, you're wrong. This is what I actually think. So what I think you said was, for personal experiences, for them to be a good way to determine truth, it depends on the amount of experiences and what the experiences are.
Yeah, I guess that's a fair way to put it. It's my opinion that personal experiences can help you determine truth. But again, that's subjective.
Earlier, I think we determined that personal experiences might not be reliable. Perhaps they can be truthful, but not 100% of the time. Is there a way that we could test these personal experiences to find out which ones are truthful and which ones may not be truthful?
I can't think of any reliable way that you could really test that, because it varies from person to person. So yeah, again, if we're going just on personal experiences, that's subjective to the person that is having the experience. I would imagine that the more common experiences that lead you to a conclusion, the more confidence you would have in that conclusion. So I think that would help determine some of the reliability.
Okay, just so I understand, I'm going to repeat it back again. So I think what you're saying is, for one particular person, if they have multiple experiences that all seem to confirm the same belief, then that might give this person a greater deal of confidence, just one single personal experience.
Yeah, that would be my opinion.
I think I asked this question before, but I'm going to quickly ask it again. With multiple personal experiences, do you think that those could lead a person to a conclusion or a belief that is untrue?
Absolutely, that's a possibility. There's a lot of variables to consider. Again, what the experience is, how often, how many times, the mentality of that person, their bias. There's a lot to take into consideration.
Is there an example you can think of somebody having a personal experience that led them to something that was untrue factually?
Honestly, the first thing that comes to mind would be like cult members and maybe certain religions. I think I mentioned before that people from all different kinds of religions will, have experiences and that lead them to a conclusion. But it's my opinion that a lot of the times those conclusions are tainted by their bias. And I think that's why I find it so hard to find a label for myself, because I said, again, I do believe there's something just because of my own experiences, but I try not to let my bias influence that. So it's hard for me to come to a conclusion other than that there is something.
Is there a way that we could test to see how much your bias has influenced you?
Well, if you could think of a method that would be reliable, I would definitely be interested in that.
I'm not sure if there is a method or not to test that. Maybe there is. If I were to demonstrate to your satisfaction that your personal experience may have been influenced by a bias, something else, to your satisfaction, would that affect your belief in God?
I think if you could show that my conclusion was affected by my bias, that might change my conclusion. But I believe that there is something, and I think in order for me to change that conclusion, it would take something equal to my experiences.
I'm not saying I would be able to do this. I don't even know what your personal experiences are. But let's say hypothetically, if I were able to demonstrate to you that your personal experience was something other than God, perhaps something with a natural cause, would that affect your belief in God, your confidence of your belief in God? Would that lower your confidence from that 100% mark?
So I'm 100% certain that there's something. I do lean towards a God, but I'm not 100% on that. If you were to be able to show that my experiences were natural, that wouldn't change my conclusion. It would change my definition of what is natural.
Okay, I'm once again gonna try to repeat back what I think I'm hearing. And what I think I'm hearing is that if you didn't have these experiences, these personal experiences, you still would come to the conclusion that there is some sort of higher power. And that may not be a God, but those personal experiences have led you to believe that it is a God. Let me know if I'm correct on that.
I am, again, 100% sure that there is something. And when I say something, I mean something outside of the natural world as we perceive it. I suppose I lean towards a God because of my biases or because of the way that I was raised, or because that might just, I'm not sure if that's the best word. What ifs are so hard. I can't imagine that if I hadn't, what my viewpoint would be if I hadn't had these experiences. But I think I would always wonder if, just because of the way that I was raised, but I do think that I would be more like an atheist without these experiences.
So you've had these personal experiences that have led you to believe that a God exists, or at least some sort of other higher power. And that has been kind of like a test in a way. It's been kind of a positive result. What could you experience that could be a negative result? A result that would lead you to believe that there is no God? Is there anything that you could experience that would lead you in the opposite direction, in the direction of there not being a God?
I couldn't fathom anything that would explain or negate the experiences that I've had. If maybe one day something like that pops up, I'd be willing to accept another explanation, but I can't see any other conclusion other than that it still would be something that is outside of what we perceive as nature.
So does that mean that there's nothing you could experience that would lessen your confidence that a God exists?
There's nothing that I could imagine that I could experience that would lessen my confidence that something exists.
If you can only experience things that will raise your confidence that a God exists, and you cannot experience things that lower your confidence that a God exists, is that applying the same standard for both a God existing and the potential of a God not existing?
I'm 100% sure that something exists, so I can't really experience anything that would give me more confidence that there is something. The nature of that something, I'm sure I could experience things that would lead me in, a different direction as to what that something is, but I'm 100% sure that there's something. I can't say what that something is, though. A lot of people say God, a lot of people believe in God, but again, I don't think that anyone really knows what it is, and I'm not sure that you really can. I wouldn't know how to test that or study it.
If you don't know how to study something or test it, is a 100% confidence in that thing a wise position to be at?
I'm not sure if I'm explaining myself very well. I'm 100% sure that there's something, but because I don't know anything about the nature of that something and I wouldn't know how to study that, I'm not at all confident about what it is, just that there is something. You don't have to know how to study something to know that it exists. You need to know how to study something in order to understand it.
Can you think of an example of something that you can't test or study, but even though you can't test or study it, you still know that it is real? Is there an example you can think of that?
That's an awesome question, and honestly, I can't think of an example that would relate to this topic as specifically as maybe I'd like, but let's say I can look up at night and see the stars, but without the correct tools, I can't study it or understand its nature. I can just know that it's there.
Thank you for your example. I really like your example of stars. And kind of sticking with your example, without any equipment, is it possible to conduct a test to see if a star exists?
Well, without any equipment, you could see that the star exists, but you couldn't understand it or study it or begin to even know its nature. All you could say with certainty is that there's something there.
I think that we are both in agreement. Test to see if a star exists. And you described that test pretty good. You can look up and see the star, see if it is there or it is not there. Now, is there a test that you can perform for a God?
I don't know that there would be any test for a God, which is why, even though I lean that way, I might not argue for it. I do believe that there's something. I don't know the nature of that. Now, the test for the star isn't really a test for the star, because can you call it a star if you don't understand anything about it? All you can do is look up and see that it's there, and even then, not everybody has the ability to look up and see that it's there. They're not there all the time. They look different depending on where you are. All that test would confirm is that some people can see some lights in the sky at night sometimes. Some people might look up and see the stars and say, those are aliens, or that's God, or those are the heavens, they're bugs. But you can't confirm that. All you can confirm is that you see something up there. So I guess my point of view is that I can 100% see something. And I think it might be a star, but I can't confirm that because I don't know how to study it. I have no way to understand it.
You can correct me if I'm wrong. I very well could be wrong in misunderstanding you. But kind of with going along with your star example and kind of comparing it to your belief in God or a higher power, right? So your personal experience is kind of like you looking up and seeing something, right? Something in the sky, and that you can confirm that you looked up and you saw something, right? So that's kind of like your personal experience. And then the it being a star would be the conclusion that someone could, look up and say, hey, that's a star, right? So, and then you're having that personal experience and you can 100% confirm that you had that experience. But can you confirm that's God or a higher power? And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I thought you were saying. I'm not 100%, so correct me if I misunderstood you.
Yeah, maybe I'm just explaining myself poorly. I think you kind of get it. Like, if you look up in the sky and you see a star, like, which would be, like, my experience, that I see something. But without being able to study it, you can't say that's a star. People can, without the knowledge that we have today, people used to think that they were all kinds of different things. But all that they could really confirm was that they see something. They couldn't tell you anything about the nature of that without studying it, and that's kind of where I'm at. So I do believe that there's something like outside of nature. There's no way for me to confirm whether that's God or a higher power or the nature of it at all. I'm open to the possibilities of other things, but I can say with 100% certainty with myself that I do know that there's something. But I do want to clear up that it's not as if I look into the sky and see something. It's not like that. It hasn't been like that. I was just more or less using the star as like a metaphor. And I mentioned earlier that people with all different types of religions will tell you that they have like spiritual or personal experiences that strengthen their belief. But it's my opinion that all they are seeing is something, and that they don't understand it, and they're letting their biases color their conclusion. In the same way that before we had the technology and the means, the equipment, the tools to study astrology, people could only tell you that they see something, and they could make educated guesses, but they couldn't understand it fully without being able to study it. Without being able to study it appropriately and fully.
Yeah, I think I know exactly what you're saying, and I think I understand it. People used to look to the stars and see something, and some of them may have came to conclusions that were very close to what we think the truth is now, and some perhaps came to conclusions that were not very close to what we perceive as the truth about stars today. I think this might be perhaps a good place to start to wrap up the conversation here. And I always like to ask anyone I speak with what questions they might have for me. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to ask as many questions as you'd like.
It's my understanding that you're an atheist, and for me that means that you lack a belief in a god or gods, that you feel that sufficient evidence hasn't been provided to you to convince you that there is.
Yes, that would sum up my position pretty well. I think a god is possible. However, I have yet to see a god demonstrated to me, and I have yet to see a reliable method to test to see if a god exists or not. So that's kind of why I lack a belief in a god.
It's my opinion that because there's no reliable way to study a god or gods or higher power or whatever else it might be, there's no way that anyone can really fully know what that is or demonstrate it to anyone else. And for me personally, without what I call spiritual experiences, I would probably have the same point of view as. I'm sure I'll have more questions pop up later, but I did enjoy our conversation.
If you don't mind, I'm just going to ask one last question. If a belief or a claim cannot be falsified, so it can't be proven wrong, is that a position that someone should continue to believe just because it can't be proven wrong?
So, I don't think that a God can or can't be proven or disproven. So, because I lack the understanding, the ability to study it, I don't claim that there is or isn't a God. I just, based on my personal experiences, know that there is something outside of us, outside of what we perceive as nature. And all I can say is that I see it, but I can't argue for the nature of it or pretend to have any kind of understanding. Which again is a lot of the times why I mostly identify as agnostic, because I don't believe that anyone does or can know anything about a God. I think that other people like myself see that there's something, I think that, again, they let their biases color what their conclusion is. I try really hard not to do that. I'm sure I do. I'm human. You can use, logic to, what's the word I'm looking for? Discredit specific gods. But again, I think a lot of religion has a lot of knowledge claim that is baseless.
I know I said I asked my last question, but I guess, has your confidence changed at all, or has your thoughts on anything we talked about changed at all?
I would say that, my confidence that there is something has not changed. But I definitely feel like I had to think about things that I personally hadn't thought of, and I appreciate that. I appreciate those kinds of questions. So again, I did enjoy the conversation.
I enjoyed it too. Hopefully I was able to ask a lot of good questions. I think you did a really great job answering them, so thank you.
Thanks. I'm really looking forward to seeing the final product.